Tale of Two Houses, Hamilton House and its garden today. Today, South Berwick, Maine, several miles inland from the Atlantic coast, is a charming, quiet New England town. In the late 18th century, however, thanks to the network of rivers connecting it to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the town was a bustling center of shipbuilding and maritime trade. Since the 1780s, the histories of South Berwick's two most prominent homes, Sarah Orne Jewett House and Hamilton House, have been closely intertwined. Built as rivals by successful merchants, one house prospered during the 19th century, while the other languished. Toward the end of the century, each one served as a setting in a novel, and in the mid-20th century, both of them became house museums, one a colonial revival showplace and the other a memorial to its most famous occupant, the author Sarah Orne Jewett. Portrait of Sarah Orne Jewett by an unknown artist, c. 1875. I was born here, and I hope to die here, leaving the lilac bushes green and growing, and all the chairs in their places, Sarah Orne Jewett told a reporter for the Boston Herald in 1895. Jewett, 1849 to 1909, is best known as a regional writer of short stories and novels filled with insightful descriptions of the country people and rural landscapes she had come to know so well. Home and a sense of community were important themes in her works, and the house where she was born was both an inspiration and a major force in her life. Although she traveled extensively and lived much of her later life in Boston, she once remarked when she returned home that it all seemed to put its arms around me. Jewett House, an imposing white clapboarded house located in the heart of town, was built by John Tilly Haggins, a merchant and veteran of the French and Indian War. Although construction began in 1774, on the eve of the American Revolution, much of the interior was not completed until the 1780s, when the war was over. About 1819, Sarah's grandfather, Captain Theodore Jewett, retired from his seafaring career and moved his family from Portsmouth to South Berwick. He rented the house from Haggins' heirs, finally purchasing it in 1839. Both Sarah and her older sister Mary lived there until 1854, when their parents built a house in the Greek Revival style next door to accommodate their growing family. From then on, there was constant interaction between the generations living in the two houses. In 1887, Mary inherited their grandfather's house from their uncle, and she and Sarah moved back permanently into the old family homestead. Their younger sister Caroline and her husband, Edwin Eastman, assumed ownership of the Greek Revival house. 5 as a girl, Jewett often traveled the countryside with her father, the local doctor. She recalled, "I was still a child when I began to write down the things I was thinking about. The quiet village life, the dull routine of farming or mill life early became interesting to me." She mourned the passing of the simple life of these everyday working people, which was being swept away as farms were sold and the area was discovered by a new, more prosperous generation. In her first novel, Deep Haven, written in 1877, Jewett used her grandfather's house as the model for the Brandon House, accurately describing many of its architectural features and furnishings: the elaborate cornices in the rooms, the graceful arch dividing the hallway, the arched window on the stair landing, the red flocked wallpaper and the curtained bed draped in white, the huge sideboard, and the corals, seashells, and other curiosities, no doubt brought back from his voyages by Grandfather Jewett. When the Jewett sisters moved back to the family homestead, a decade after Deep Haven was written, they kept much of what the previous two generations had accumulated, but they also redecorated some of the rooms in the more aesthetic taste of the 1880s. For the hall, they chose wallpaper with large leaves and tulips, and a new William Morris carpet. Sarah redid her bedroom, using pew doors rescued from a local church as paneling and a wallpaper with a pattern that resembles her initials. After both sisters died, the house passed to their nephew, Theodore Eastman, and he in turn bequeathed it in 1931 to historic New England as a memorial to his aunt Sarah. Although he left most of the furnishings to a cousin, Sarah's own bedroom remained as it was in her lifetime. In recent years, several original furnishings have been returned and placed where they were in the old family home, so treasured by the author. One of Sarah Orne Jewett's favorite places in South Berwick, to visit alone or to show to friends, was Hamilton House, a few miles out of town and down a long drive. Although the property was looking somewhat desolate, Sarah loved the aura of the stately mansion. In 1881, in her short story River Driftwood, she described it as the quiet place that the destroying left hand of progress had failed to touch. She later used it as the setting for her most ambitious novel, The Tory Lover, in which she perpetuated the local myth that the house had been built before the American Revolution and that John Paul Jones had dined there before setting sail on the Ranger. When Hamilton House came up for sale in the 1890s, Jewett embarked on a search for a buyer to purchase it as a summer house and thereby preserve it. Standing on a bluff overlooking the Salmon Falls River, Hamilton House occupies a dramatic site. In the 1780s, the location was chosen by Jonathan Hamilton, 1745 to 1802, who was proud of his rise from humble beginnings to his stature as one of the most successful merchants in the area. He was equally proud, 10th, that he was going to build a finer house than Tilly Haggins. Hamilton's fortune came from exporting timber and importing rum, molasses, and slaves from the West Indies. Since the river was navigable to this point, 15 miles from its mouth, he could bring his ships right up to the wharves and warehouses he had built almost at his doorstep. Tradition relates that the house was surrounded by beautiful gardens, and a probate inventory of its contents records the elegant furnishings of the rooms. But Hamilton's success was short-lived. He died in 1802, and eventually all his children moved away. The epitaph on his gravestone emphatically proclaimed, "Hamilton is no more." In 1839, Alpheus Goodwin, who made his livelihood farming, raising sheep, and developing apple orchards on the property, purchased the house and land. Toward the end of the 60-year occupancy by the Goodwins, however, the farming operation, like so many in New England at that time, was in decline, and the family was not in a position to make necessary repairs. Hamilton's best drawing room now served as a second kitchen, and the attic was used to store corn. Jewett managed to persuade some acquaintances, the widowed Mrs. George Tyson, 1846 to 1922, and her stepdaughter Elise, 1871 to 1949, later Mrs., to come look at the property. So charmed were they, after each seeing it only once, Elise on a June day and her stepmother, when the mansion was surrounded by 3 feet of snow, that in 1898 they purchased the house and 110 acres of land. They immediately embarked on a project to restore the house and gardens to their former glory, and with the help of Boston architect Herbert W. C. Brown, created what Elise called this wondrous old place. A Tale of Two Houses. Elise Tyson photographed the unidentified paper hanger in the upstairs hall in 1898. The addition of wings on either side of the house for the conveniences of an up-to-date kitchen, laundry, and bathrooms allowed the relatively untouched interiors of the old building to remain intact. The Tysons' only major change inside was to remove a side hall to create a larger dining room. The finished rooms in the dormered attic provided adequate space for servants' rooms and a sewing room. Although the Tysons went to the effort of reproducing Hamilton's original front hall wallpaper, their overall approach was to create a comfortable summer house that evoked the spirit of the past instead of slavishly copying it. They decorated the rooms in tones of green and blue to echo the colors of the garden and the river outside, and furnished them with antiques that they purchased from homes and auctions on antiquing trips in the surrounding countryside. Ship models helped recall Jonathan Hamilton's trade in far-off places. Romanticizing the past lies at the heart of what is now termed the Colonial Revival movement. Nowhere is this vision better portrayed than in the front parlor, where in 1907, artist George Porter Fernald painted murals in the style of a French scenic wallpaper. Images of historic houses in the area are lined up along the banks of a river that flows along the walls of the room. Men and women in 18th century costume and powdered wigs are seen watching ships being unloaded and enjoying a tea party beside a fountain, complement Uri murals depicting Italian gardens in the dining room. A year later, Fernald returned to paint scenes of Italian gardens on the dining room walls, providing a link to the handsome garden just outside, which Mrs. Tyson had created on the site of the Goodwins' barn. This garden, too, was a romantic affair, with flower-filled beds surrounding a sundial and a vine-covered pergola enclosing the entire space. A garden cottage constructed with beams and paneling from an old house nearby was situated overlooking the river behind a manicured hedge. With an old house filled with antiques and a garden overflowing with old-fashioned flowers, the Tysons created at Hamilton House a colonial environment at its most ideal. One writer summed up its appeal in 1915 when she wrote, "In isolation, simplicity, and ripeness, the atmosphere of the whole place breathes of olden days." A Tale of Two Houses, below Elise Tyson, entertaining friends in the dining room, 1903. Write Emily Tyson enjoying her garden. Facing page. The house as it appeared on the pages of House Beautiful magazine in 1929, photographed by Paul J. Weber. Viewed as an excellent example of colonial revival taste, Hamilton House reached a national audience in 1929 when 4 separate articles, one each on the interior, the murals, the garden, and the garden cottage, were published in House Beautiful magazine. Because of her knowledge of old houses and antiques, Mrs. Vaughan became involved in several other historic house museums in the area, and when Sarah Orne Jewett House, minus its furnishings, became a property of historic New England, she was put in charge of its restoration. By this time, she had also decided to bequeath her own house to historic New England upon her death, which occurred in 1949. In the mid-20th century, time and weather affected Hamilton House in its exposed location. Severe winters and 2 hurricanes damaged the garden pergola beyond repair. The latticed service wings added by the Tysons were removed, and today the exterior of the house looks much as it did in Jonathan Hamilton's time. Today, the interiors of both Jewett House and Hamilton House have been restored by Historic New England to recreate and interpret the periods it deems most significant. Jewett House to portray the dear old house and home, as Sarah Orne Jewett knew it, and Hamilton House to evoke Emily and Elise Tyson's early 20th century romanticized recreation of the colonial past. 22.
Thank you for joining me on the tour of the stunning Hamilton House in Berwick, Maine. This National Historic Landmark is a true treasure, showcasing colonial-era architecture and picturesque views. If you're fascinated by Maine's history and beauty, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more tours and explorations. Visit the Hamilton House in person to experience its charm firsthand. Follow me on social media for behind-the-scenes peeks and upcoming videos. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, explore, discover, and appreciate Maine's hidden gems.